Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez adjusted her radio headset as the convoy rolled through the dusty streets of Fallujah. The morning sun cast long shadows between the concrete barriers that lined the road. She had been deployed to Iraq for 8 months, serving as a communications specialist with the 82nd Airborne Division. Today felt different, though. The usual chatter on the radio seemed more tense, and intelligence reports suggested increased insurgent activity in their sector. Maria glanced at her watch. The convoy was running ahead of schedule, which made her uneasy. In her experience, being early in a war zone often meant walking into trouble. The lead vehicle, a heavily armored MRAP, suddenly slowed down. Through her dusty windshield, she could see the convoy commander's hand signals indicating a potential roadside bomb ahead. The 26-year-old sergeant from Texas had joined the Army straight out of high school. Her parents had immigrated from Mexico when she was young, and military service felt like her way of giving back to the country that had given her family opportunities. She was known among her unit for her quick thinking and ability to maintain communications even under pressure. As the convoy came to a complete stop, Maria began running through her mental checklist. She checked her weapon, ensured her radio was functioning properly, and scanned the surrounding buildings for any signs of movement. The architecture of Fallujah always reminded her of pictures she had seen of ancient cities. Flat-roofed buildings in various states of repair, narrow alleyways that could hide dangers, and windows that stared down like dark eyes. Her vehicle commander, Sergeant First Class Johnson, was coordinating with the lead vehicle when the first explosion rocked their world. The roadside bomb had detonated under the second vehicle in the convoy, sending a massive plume of dust and debris into the air. Maria's training kicked in immediately as she began calling for medical evacuation and backup support. The radio crackled with urgent voices as chaos erupted around them. Small arms fire began raining down from multiple directions, indicating this was a coordinated ambush. Maria could hear the distinctive crack of AK-47 rounds striking their vehicle's armor. She maintained her position, continuing to coordinate communications while return fire echoed through the streets. Through the confusion, she noticed movement in a building to their left. Insurgents were positioning themselves for what appeared to be a flanking maneuver. Maria grabbed her rifle and prepared to defend her position while still maintaining radio contact with higher command. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on her shoulders as she realized their convoy was outnumbered and potentially surrounded. The firefight intensified as more insurgents joined the battle. Maria could see muzzle flashes from windows and rooftops around them. Her fellow soldiers were taking cover behind their vehicles, returning fire while medics worked frantically to help the wounded from the bombed vehicle. The smell of gunpowder and burning fuel filled the air. As Maria repositioned herself to get a better angle on the attackers, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. A group of insurgents was moving through the buildings in a pattern that suggested they were trying to cut off the convoy's escape route. She immediately radioed this information to her commander while adjusting her own position to provide covering. Fire. The battle had been raging for nearly 20 minutes when Maria made a decision that would change everything. She could see that her unit needed better intelligence on enemy positions to effectively fight back. Without hesitation, she volunteered to move to a forward position where she could get eyes on the insurgents and coordinate more accurate return fire. Her commander initially refused, but Maria insisted that her communications equipment and training made her the best choice for the mission. Time was running out and they needed actionable intelligence. With reluctant approval, she gathered her gear and prepared to move forward into what everyone knew was an extremely dangerous position. As Maria prepared to leave the relative safety of her vehicle, she thought briefly of her family back home in San Antonio. Her mother had always worried about her deployment, lighting candles at church every Sunday for her safe return. Her younger brother had just started college, something that was only possible because of Maria's military benefits helping the family financially. She checked her equipment one final time. Radio, extra batteries, medical supplies, ammunition, and water. The forward position she needed to reach was only about 50 meters away, but those 50 meters would require crossing open ground while under enemy fire. Maria took a deep breath, said a quick prayer, and prepared to sprint toward what might be her final mission. Maria burst from cover as her fellow soldiers laid down suppressing fire. The 50 meters to the forward position felt like 50 miles as bullets whizzed past her head and kicked up dust around her boots. Her heart pounded against her chest as she zigzagged between pieces of concrete debris, and abandoned vehicles that littered the street. Halfway to her destination, she felt the first bullet tear through her left shoulder. The impact spun her around, but adrenaline kept her moving forward. Training had taught her that stopping in the open meant certain death. She gritted her teeth against the burning pain and continued her desperate sprint toward the partially collapsed building that would provide her the vantage point she needed. The second bullet caught her in the thigh just as she reached the building's entrance. This time the impact brought her to her knees, but she crawled the remaining distance to the doorway. Blood was seeping through her uniform, but Maria forced herself to focus on the mission. She set up her radio equipment behind a pile of rubble and began calling in enemy positions to her unit. From her new position, Maria could see the full scope of the ambush. At least 20 insurgents had positioned themselves in a horseshoe formation around the convoy. They were well-armed and clearly experienced fighters who had planned this attack carefully. She began methodically calling out targets to her fellow soldiers, directing their fire with precision that came from years of training. Her radio work was making a difference. The convoy's return fire became more accurate and effective as Maria guided them to specific threats. She watched through her binoculars as several insurgent positions were neutralized by her coordinated fire direction. For a moment it seemed like the tide of battle might be turning in their favor. That moment of hope ended when Maria spotted the rocket-propelled grenade team setting up in a window across the street. They had a clear shot at the convoy's fuel truck, and if that vehicle exploded, it would likely kill or wound most of her unit. Without hesitation, she radioed the threat and then made another life-altering decision. Maria grabbed her rifle and began engaging the RPG team directly. Her shots were accurate despite her wounds, and she managed to eliminate one of the insurgents before they could fire their weapon. However, her muzzle flashes had given away her position to other enemy fighters, and suddenly the building she was hiding in became the focus of intense enemy fire. Concrete chunks exploded around her as automatic weapons tore into the building's walls. Maria tried to move to a different position within the structure, but her wounded leg made movement slow and painful. She could feel herself getting weaker as blood loss began to take its toll, but she continued coordinating fire and engaging targets when she could. The third bullet hit her in the abdomen, doubling her over with pain. Maria gasped and pressed her hand against the wound, feeling warm blood seeping between her fingers. Her radio crackled with voices asking for her status, but speaking had become difficult. She managed to whisper her condition and continued position reports, determined to help her unit survive even as her own situation became increasingly desperate. Through her fading vision, Maria watched as more insurgents moved to surround her building. They had figured out that eliminating her would significantly reduce the convoy's ability to coordinate effective defense. She tried to change positions again, but found that her strength was rapidly leaving her body. Each movement required tremendous effort. The fourth and fifth bullets arrived almost simultaneously, one striking her right arm and another grazing her head. The head wound filled her eyes with blood, making it nearly impossible to see her targets clearly. Maria wiped the blood away with her good hand and continued trying to operate her radio. Though her coordination was becoming increasingly impaired, her fellow soldiers were still fighting desperately to break out of the ambush, but they were taking heavy casualties without her precise fire direction. Maria could hear the urgency in their radio calls as they requested her status and tried to coordinate a rescue attempt. She wanted to tell them not to risk more lives for her, but the words wouldn't come. As enemy fighters closed in on her building, Maria made one final transmission. She provided the coordinates of her position and told her unit to call in artillery fire on her location. It was the only way to eliminate the insurgents who were about to overrun her position and potentially use it to destroy the convoy. Her voice was barely audible as she gave what she believed would be her final orders. The enemy was now inside the building, moving methodically through the rooms to find her. Maria could hear their footsteps and voices growing closer. She destroyed her radio equipment to prevent it from falling into enemy hands and prepared for what she expected would be her last stand. Despite everything, she felt a strange sense of peace knowing that her sacrifice might save her fellow soldiers. With her remaining strength, Maria positioned herself behind cover and waited. Her vision was blurry, her body felt cold, and breathing had become labored. Multiple bullet wounds were taking their toll, but her mind remained focused on one thing: buying enough time for artillery support to arrive. She could only hope that her unit would follow through on the fire mission she had called in on her own position. The artillery strike never came. Maria's unit commander had refused to authorize fire on her position, instead ordering an immediate assault to extract her. Through her fading consciousness, she could hear the battle intensifying as her fellow soldiers fought to reach her building, but the insurgents had found her first. 3 armed fighters entered the room where Maria lay bleeding behind a pile of debris. She tried to raise her weapon, but her arms no longer responded to her commands. The insurgents spoke rapidly in Arabic as they approached her position. One of them kicked her rifle away while another searched her for intelligence materials. Maria tried to focus on their faces, but everything was becoming increasingly blurry. To her surprise, the insurgents didn't execute her immediately. Instead, they seemed to be debating what to do with a wounded American soldier. Maria caught fragments of their conversation, something about using her as leverage or propaganda. One of the fighters was clearly arguing for killing her immediately, while another wanted to keep her alive. The discussion gave her a few precious moments to assess her situation. Maria counted at least 14 separate wounds across her body. Some were through and through gunshot wounds, while others had left bullets lodged in her muscles and organs. The most serious appeared to be the abdominal wound, which was causing internal bleeding. She could taste blood in her mouth, suggesting possible lung damage as well. By all medical logic, she should already be dead. The insurgents made their decision. They would move her to a different location, where she could be used as a bargaining chip or for propaganda videos. 2 of them grabbed her arms and began dragging her across the concrete floor. The movement sent waves of agony through her wounded body, but Maria bit down on her lip to avoid giving them the satisfaction of hearing her scream. As they moved her through the building, Maria tried to memorize details about her captors and surroundings. Military training had taught her that intelligence gathering continued even as a prisoner. She noted their weapons, their apparent ages, and any distinguishing features she could observe through her compromised vision. If she somehow survived this ordeal, the information might prove valuable. They dragged her to a basement area that had been converted into some kind of command post. Radio equipment and maps covered a makeshift table, and several more insurgents were present. Maria realized she had stumbled into what appeared to be a significant enemy position. The intelligence value of this location would be enormous if she could somehow communicate it to her unit. One of the insurgents, who seemed to be in command, examined Maria's wounds with what appeared to be medical knowledge. He spoke to the others in Arabic, pointing to various injuries. Maria couldn't understand the words, but his tone suggested concern about her condition. Perhaps they realized that keeping their prisoner alive would require immediate medical attention. A fighter who appeared to be a medic began working on Maria's wounds. His treatment was rough but effective, applying pressure bandages and crude tourniquets to slow the bleeding. Maria was surprised by this development. She had expected execution, not medical care. The realization that they intended to keep her alive brought both hope and dread. During the medical treatment, Maria heard something that made her heart race with excitement. Radio chatter in English was coming from equipment in the corner. Her captors were monitoring American military communications, and she could hear her own unit calling for artillery support and planning their extraction attempt. The knowledge that her fellow soldiers were still fighting to save her gave her strength. The enemy medic continued working on her wounds while the command team discussed something urgently around their maps. Maria tried to remain conscious and alert, fighting against the blood loss and shock that threatened to pull her into darkness. She knew that staying aware of her surroundings and her captors' activities might be crucial to any rescue attempt. As the insurgent medic finished his work, Maria noticed something significant. The basement had only one entrance, and it was poorly defended. If her unit could locate this position, they might be able to mount a successful rescue operation. She began memorizing every detail she could about the layout and the number of fighters present. The enemy commander approached her and spoke in broken English. He wanted information about American troop movements and planned operations. Maria responded with only her name, rank, and service number as required by the Geneva Convention. The commander's expression darkened, suggesting that her lack of cooperation would lead to harsh treatment. One of the insurgents brought a video camera into the basement. Maria realized they planned to record a propaganda video with her as the centerpiece. She steeled herself for what was coming, knowing that these videos were often used to demoralize American forces and families back home. She was determined not to give them anything they could use against her country. As they set up the recording equipment, Maria focused on staying conscious and maintaining her dignity. She thought about her family, her unit, and her oath to defend her country. Even as a prisoner, wounded and alone, she remained a United States soldier. That identity gave her strength to face whatever horrors lay ahead. The camera began recording, and the enemy commander started speaking in Arabic to his intended audience. Maria couldn't understand his words, but she could see the hatred in his eyes as he gestured toward her. She maintained eye contact with the camera, trying to project strength despite her desperate situation. If this video reached her family or her unit, she wanted them to see that she was still fighting. The propaganda video session was interrupted by urgent radio communications. Maria's unit had begun a coordinated assault on the neighborhood, and the insurgent positions were coming under heavy fire. The enemy commander barked orders to his fighters, and most of them rushed upstairs to defend their positions, leaving only 2 guards with Maria in the basement. Maria watched through half-closed eyes as chaos erupted above them. The sound of gunfire, explosions, and shouting filtered down through the concrete ceiling. Her guards were clearly nervous, constantly looking toward the stairs and arguing with each other in Arabic. She sensed that this might be her only opportunity to effect her own rescue. Despite her severe wounds, Maria began testing her physical limitations. She discovered that while her left arm was nearly useless and her leg wounds made walking impossible, she still had some movement in her right arm. The insurgent medic's crude bandages had slowed her bleeding enough that she wasn't immediately dying, though she remained critically injured. One of her guards made a critical mistake. He moved close to check her restraints just as a particularly loud explosion shook the building. Maria used her functioning arm to grab the knife from his belt, surprising him with her speed despite her injuries. The struggle was brief but intense, ending when Maria managed to wound him seriously enough that he collapsed. The second guard raised his weapon, but Maria had positioned herself behind his wounded companion. In the confusion and poor lighting of the basement, the guard hesitated, giving Maria precious seconds to act. She threw the knife with her remaining strength, striking the second guard and causing him to drop his rifle. Both of her captors were now neutralized, though Maria was exhausted by the effort. Maria dragged herself across the floor to reach the radio equipment she had observed earlier. Her military communications training allowed her to quickly identify the frequency her unit was using. With tremendous effort, she managed to activate the radio and began transmitting her location and the intelligence she had gathered about the enemy command post. The response was immediate. Her unit commander's voice crackled through the speaker, expressing amazement that she was alive and conscious. Maria provided rapid intelligence updates about the basement layout, the number of insurgents in the building, and the significance of the command post. Every word was an effort, but she forced herself to remain coherent. Above them, the battle was intensifying as her unit focused their assault on the building. Maria could hear American voices getting closer, but she also heard insurgents regrouping for a final stand. She warned her unit about potential booby traps and suggested the best approach routes based on what she had observed during her captivity. During a brief lull in the radio communication, Maria took inventory of her condition. The exertion of fighting her guards and reaching the radio had reopened several wounds. Blood was pooling beneath her, and her vision was becoming increasingly unreliable. She realized that even if rescue came, her chances of survival were diminishing rapidly. The insurgent commander's voice echoed down the stairwell as he returned to the basement. He was shouting orders and seemed to be planning either an escape or a final defensive stand. Maria quickly switched off the radio and tried to position herself as if she were still secured and unconscious. She hoped to maintain the element of surprise if the opportunity arose to assist in her own rescue. Heavy footsteps on the stairs announced the return of multiple insurgents to the basement. Through barely opened eyes, Maria watched as they discovered their wounded comrades and realized she had somehow freed herself. The commander was furious, screaming at his remaining fighters while examining the unconscious guards. His rage was focused entirely on Maria. The insurgent commander approached her with his weapon raised, clearly intending to execute her for her resistance. Maria met his gaze without flinching, maintaining her dignity even in what appeared to be her final moments. She had done everything possible to help her unit, and she was prepared to face death as a soldier. The execution was prevented by a massive explosion that shook the entire building. American forces had breached the upper levels and were fighting room by room toward the basement. The commander and his remaining fighters took defensive positions, using Maria as a human shield while preparing for the final assault. Maria could hear her fellow soldiers moving through the building above, calling out tactical commands and clearing rooms methodically. The sounds of combat were getting closer, but she knew that the basement's single entrance made it a perfect killing ground for the defenders. Her rescuers were walking into a trap. Using the chaos and noise to mask her movements, Maria managed to reach the radio one more time. She transmitted crucial information about the basement's defensive setup and warned her unit about the ambush waiting for them. Her voice was barely a whisper, but the intelligence reached her, Commander, just as the assault team reached the stairwell. The final battle for the basement began with smoke, grenades and flashbang devices that disoriented everyone in the confined space. Maria pressed herself against the floor as gunfire erupted around her. The insurgents fought desperately, knowing that capture meant certain death or imprisonment. Her fellow soldiers moved with precision, using the intelligence she had provided to minimize their exposure to enemy fire. In the chaos of the firefight, Maria felt herself slipping in and out of consciousness. The combination of blood loss, shock, and the stress of combat was overwhelming her body's remaining reserves. She could hear American voices very close now, but everything was becoming distant and dreamlike. Her final thought before darkness claimed her was gratitude that she had been able to help her unit one last time. When the smoke cleared, Sergeant First Class Johnson found Maria lying motionless in a pool of blood. For a terrible moment, he thought they had arrived too late. Then he noticed the barely perceptible rise and fall of her chest. Against all odds, she was still breathing. The medic rushed forward while Johnson secured the basement and confirmed that all insurgents had been neutralized. The combat medic, Specialist Davis, had seen many battlefield injuries during his deployment, but Maria's condition shocked him. He counted 14 distinct bullet wounds across her body, along with severe blood loss and signs of shock. By every medical standard he knew, she should have died hours ago, yet somehow her heart was still beating, though barely. Davis immediately began emergency medical procedures. He established an airway, started IV fluids to combat shock, and applied fresh bandages to the most serious wounds. His hands moved with practiced efficiency while he called for an urgent medical evacuation. Every second counted if there was any hope of saving Maria's life. The evacuation presented serious challenges. The building was still surrounded by hostile forces, and getting a medical helicopter to the location would require clearing a significant area of insurgents. Johnson coordinated with higher command, while his soldiers established a defensive perimeter around the building. Air support was called in to suppress enemy activity in the surrounding blocks. Maria drifted in and out of consciousness during the medical treatment. In her brief moments of awareness, she could hear familiar voices and feel gentle hands working on her wounds. The contrast with her recent captivity was overwhelming. These were her brothers and sisters in arms, risking their lives to save hers, just as she had risked everything to save theirs. The sound of rotors announced the arrival of a medical evacuation helicopter. The crew included a flight surgeon who took one look at Maria's condition and shook his head in amazement. Her vital signs were barely detectable, and the amount of blood loss should have been fatal. Yet she was still alive, still fighting with the same determination that had carried her through the ambush and captivity. Loading Maria onto the helicopter required extreme care due to her multiple injuries. The medical team worked to stabilize her for transport while maintaining the IV lines and monitoring her weakening pulse. Every movement caused fresh bleeding, but they had no choice but to risk the journey to the combat hospital where she might have a chance at survival. During the helicopter flight, Maria's condition deteriorated rapidly. She went into cardiac arrest twice, requiring emergency resuscitation procedures in the cramped confines of the aircraft. The flight surgeon and his team worked frantically to keep her alive during the 20-minute flight that felt like hours. Her heart kept stopping, and each time they managed to restart it, the rhythm was weaker than before. The combat hospital at Forward Operating Base Liberty had been alerted about the incoming casualty. A team of surgeons, nurses, and specialists was standing by when the helicopter landed. They had been briefed on Maria's condition and had prepared multiple operating rooms for what they knew would be a complex series of surgeries. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the head trauma surgeon, took charge of Maria's case the moment she arrived. With over 15 years of experience in military medicine, she had seen soldiers survive seemingly impossible injuries. However, Maria's case was extraordinary even by wartime standards. The doctor's initial assessment confirmed 14 bullet wounds, massive blood loss, and multiple organ damage. The first surgery lasted 8 hours as Dr. Mitchell and her team worked to repair the most life-threatening injuries. They removed bullet fragments from Maria's abdomen, repaired damaged organs, and addressed the internal bleeding that was slowly killing her. Throughout the procedure, her vital signs remained critically unstable, requiring constant intervention to keep her heart beating. Recovery was complicated by infection, shock, and the sheer magnitude of her injuries. Maria remained unconscious for days while her body fought to heal. The medical staff maintained round-the-clock monitoring, adjusting medications and treatments as her condition fluctuated between slight improvement and dangerous deterioration. Her family was notified and flown to Germany, where she would be transferred for specialized care. Maria's mother, Carmen Rodriguez, arrived at the hospital just as her daughter was being prepared for another surgery. The sight of her child covered in bandages and connected to multiple machines was devastating. Carmen had always known the risks of military service, but seeing Maria so close to death tested her faith and strength in ways she had never imagined. The medical team explained Maria's condition to her family with careful honesty. While she had survived the initial trauma and surgeries, the extent of her injuries meant that recovery would be long and uncertain. Brain damage from blood loss was a concern, as was the possibility of permanent disability from her wounds. However, the fact that she was still alive was itself miraculous. Days passed with Maria hovering between life and death. Her family maintained a constant vigil while medical professionals provided the best care possible. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, her vital signs began to stabilize. The infection that had threatened to overwhelm her system responded to antibiotics. Her heart rhythm strengthened and her breathing became less labored. The first sign of consciousness came nearly 2 weeks after her rescue. Maria's eyes fluttered open briefly and she seemed to recognize her mother's voice. The moment was brief, but it represented hope that her mind had survived the trauma relatively intact. Dr. Mitchell, cautiously optimistic, but warned the family that recovery would be measured in months, not days. News of Maria's survival spread through military channels and eventually reached the media. Her story became a symbol of courage and resilience, inspiring fellow soldiers and civilians alike. However, for Maria and her family, the focus remained on the daily struggle of healing and rehabilitation. The long journey back to health was just beginning, but she had already achieved the impossible by surviving when survival seemed impossible. 6 months after the ambush in Fallujah, Maria Rodriguez sat in a wheelchair at Walter Reed Medical Center, looking out the window at the Washington, D.C. skyline. Her recovery had been nothing short of miraculous, though it came with significant challenges. 3 of the 14 bullets remained in her body, because removing them would cause more damage than leaving them in place. She had lost partial use of her left arm and walked with a pronounced limp. The physical therapy sessions were grueling, but Maria approached them with the same determination that had kept her alive in that basement in Iraq. Her therapist, Captain Williams, was amazed by her progress. Most patients with similar injuries would have been content with basic mobility, but Maria was determined to regain as much function as possible. She had goals beyond mere survival. The psychological healing proved more complex than the physical recovery. Maria experienced nightmares, flashbacks, and episodes of anxiety that were common among combat veterans with severe trauma. The hospital's mental health team worked with her to develop coping strategies, but the real healing came from reconnecting with her fellow soldiers who had survived the ambush. Sergeant First Class Johnson visited regularly, bringing news from their unit and updates on the ongoing war. He told Maria that the intelligence she had provided during her captivity had led to several successful operations against insurgent networks in Fallujah. Her sacrifice had saved not only her immediate unit but potentially hundreds of other American soldiers who might have been targeted by those same insurgent cells. The story of Maria's survival had attracted national attention, but she remained reluctant to embrace the spotlight. Military officials wanted her to participate in recruiting efforts and public relations campaigns, but Maria felt uncomfortable being portrayed as a hero. In her mind, she had simply done her job as a soldier, and the real heroes were the men and women still fighting overseas. Dr. Mitchell continued to monitor Maria's progress and remained amazed by her case. Medical literature contained few examples of patients surviving such extensive trauma, particularly under combat conditions with limited immediate medical care. Maria's survival had become a case study that would be used to train future military medical personnel in treating massive trauma injuries. During one of her therapy sessions, Maria made a decision that surprised everyone around her. Despite her injuries and the obvious challenges she faced, she expressed a desire to remain in military service in some capacity. The idea of being medically retired felt like giving up, and Maria had never been someone who quit when faced with obstacles. The Army was initially hesitant about Maria's desire to continue serving. Her physical limitations would prevent her from returning to combat roles, and traditional desk assignments seemed inadequate for someone with her experience and determination. However, her unique perspective as someone who had survived the worst combat could offer made her valuable in ways that went beyond standard military occupational specialties. A new opportunity emerged when the Army's training command requested Maria's assistance in developing survival and resistance training programs. Her first-hand experience of capture, interrogation, and survival under extreme conditions made her uniquely qualified to teach other soldiers how to endure similar situations. The assignment would allow her to continue serving while accommodating her physical limitations. Maria's family struggled with her decision to remain in the military. Her mother had hoped that surviving such trauma would convince her daughter to pursue a safer civilian career. However, Carmen Rodriguez gradually came to understand that military service was not just Maria's job, but her calling. The Army had given her purpose, identity, and a way to serve something larger than herself. The transition to her new role was challenging but rewarding. Maria found that sharing her story with other soldiers helped them prepare mentally for the realities of combat. She emphasized the importance of never giving up, maintaining hope even in the darkest circumstances and looking out for fellow soldiers. Her classes became some of the most requested in the Army's training curriculum. 2 years after the ambush, Maria was promoted to Sergeant First Class and received the Silver Star for her actions in Fallujah. The medal ceremony was attended by her family, her former unit members, and Dr. Mitchell. During her acceptance speech, Maria dedicated the award to the soldiers who had died in the ambush and those who had risked their lives to save her. The insurgent commander who had held her captive was eventually captured by coalition forces during a raid based on intelligence she had provided. Learning of his capture brought Maria a sense of closure, though she felt no personal animosity toward him. The war had made enemies of people who might have been friends under different circumstances, and hatred only perpetuated the cycle of violence. Maria's story continued to inspire people long after the immediate drama of her survival had faded from headlines. She received letters from wounded veterans, military families, and civilians who found strength in her example. Many wrote that her story had helped them overcome their own challenges, whether related to military service or civilian struggles. On quiet evenings at Walter Reed, Maria often reflected on the moment in that Fallujah basement when she had prepared to die. The experience had taught her that life was precious but fragile, that courage meant doing what was right even when afraid, and that the bonds between soldiers were stronger than any enemy could break. She had been given a second chance at life, and she was determined to use it meaningfully. The scars would always remain, both visible and hidden, but they had become part of who she was rather than limitations on who she could become. Maria Rodriguez had survived 14 bullets and 48 hours of captivity, not through luck alone, but through the strength of will, the training of a professional soldier, and the love of people who refused to abandon her. Her heart had kept beating when it should have stopped, and that rhythm now carried her forward into whatever challenges lay ahead.